Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. I'm also the conference director. I'd just like to start off by saying that tickets will remain on sale for this event until the 1st of January because everything, including the live Q&As, will be stored on this platform, and they'll actually be stored until late June, so 6 months. I would ask anybody who wants questions to be put to Debbie to do so through the Zoom link rather than on the Hoover link, because we're unable to monitor that at the moment. I'm sorry. So if you've asked any questions there, then please post them in Zoom. And if you want to ask any questions, please do so through the Q&A rather than the chat. So that'll be Nova. My co-host today is the wonderful Sally Ann Burris, who runs the website Split the Difference. She's a member of Gender Parity UK. And my interview with her will be published at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, followed by her Q&A. So I look forward to that. Our interviewee today is the marvelous Debbie Powney, probably the most high-profile academic, I would say, in the UK today, in the area of domestic violence and surrounding things. So, sorry, just a moment. Carl Palmer says, how do we get the Zoom link? Okay, well, if you're in Hoover, you need to exit. Click on the agenda link again. That should give you the option of Zoom or Hoover. So click on Zoom. Hopefully that's clear. Deborah, I mean, pretty well everybody hopefully will have seen your, the interview just now. I think that's with Elizabeth and myself, wasn't it? It's going back a bit now.
It was, yeah.
Yes. So a very warm welcome. And I wonder, Sally, if you could maybe ask the first question.
From Sean, yes.
No, sorry, no, one of
yes, my
questions. Start with Sean. Yes, we have quite a few questions now, so that's great.
I can see there's quite a gathering. So yeah, so Sean is saying, isn't it the duty of academics to inform themselves? Deborah tells of times she's enlightened feminist colleagues about the gaps in their knowledge, and yet they do not part from the ideology which has kept them in ignorance. How can such people possibly be regarded as academics? Very good question.
Okay, I would say I see your point. I would say that the colleagues that I have interacted with very much have taken on board what I've said. That doesn't mean to say that they then have to change their research, because as a feminist scholar, you have a female-centered research, and so you'll absolutely focus on women. And scholars, as we get more and more involved, we tend to get more and more narrow on our view of research, because we take a narrow but deep view of our research. So, however, within my university, the view is that there's a team that come from various different angles, and we all bring something to the table. There's an inclusive mandate there. So there will be feminist scholars that bring their information to the table. There'll be people like me that bring my information to the table. There'll be others that bring LGBT information to the table, and so on and so forth. Male perpetrators, female perpetrators, impact on children. And it is our goal to build a fully inclusive team, because it's such a complex arena that it's very difficult to have an expert that has a complete picture of the entire field. But I can only speak for my department, where I can 100% qualify that although I don't expect in any way scholars to completely change their research and completely change their view on it, there is an utter acceptance amongst our team that everybody has something to bring to the table. And from my perspective, that is really healthy. You know, you can still have research in a specific area, say women-centered, because the research I'm bringing to the table is more often than not male-centered. But bringing all those viewpoints and expertise together gives us a really comprehensive view of the complexity of this issue.
Thank you, Debs. We come to the first of Steve Moxon's questions. They're always interesting. Combining several lines of evidence, not least the profound vignette studies by Catherine Cross and Anne Campbell, it appears male PV, partner violence, is through psychopathology or otherwise profound disinhibition, especially severe alcohol abuse, overcoming default male self-inhibition concerning physically aggressing towards a female in any context, whereas female partner violence appears to be normal female behavior. Do you concur?
Oh, right. That's something to unpick. Thank you, Steve. So we're looking at motivations here for why domestic abuse is perpetrated. So more often than not, this is where I disagree with the gendered model. Well, one area where I disagree with the gendered model, simply because the explanation for male perpetrated domestic abuse is reduced to a sentence, which is men commit violence against women because they are women. And interwoven in that explanation is this notion that women are oppressed by men, and we often hear have been for millennia, and that is the cause of domestic abuse. And if we just take male perpetration of domestic abuse for the moment, that, for me, that sentence prevents full investigation of the causes of domestic abuse. And then that has two profound effects. A, it reduces academic curiosity. So that explanation will then stop people looking for other causes of that. But also it then means that perpetrator programs are based on information that may not, and evidence shows that the perpetrator programs based on, for example, the Duluth model, don't have any real impact. But that then leaves female victims vulnerable. If someone just does a tick box exercise of going through a flawed behavioral change for domestic abuse, and you're a male perpetrator, and then they come out and say, well, I've done that course, I can go back to my partner, it doesn't really have any effect, because it's not tackled the issues that are underlying that domestic abuse perpetration, which may be attachment, jealousy, conflict management, emotional regulation, addiction, all the jealousy, all sorts of different issues that are being hidden, as it were, by this sentence, men commit domestic abuse against women because they are women. And as I've said previously, that sentence also irks me, because how do female victims overcome that notion of you're a victim because you're a woman? It centers it centers the domestic violence focus in the wrong place and looking at the wrong things. I understand where Steve's coming from with his notion of it's normal for women, because there's literature that shows that girls, for example, young girls in school, use tactics that could be seen and are seen in the explanation of coercive control, isolating, smearing, bullying other girls. Yes, that does happen.
Sorry, Debs, but would that come under the umbrella of passive aggressive behaviour, do you think?
No, I would say, well, certainly John Archer, who looked at this at some depth and length, described it as indirect aggression. So it was just a way of describing this as not being directly physical aggression. And essentially, and this is a very blunt nutshell, what he was saying, and what the literature says all around this, is that when boys have conflict at a young age, there tends to be it tends to be immediate and explosive. So boys scrap and this, that, and the other, and then they either separate and don't bother with each other, unless you go into bullying, which is slightly different, or they have a scrap and they make friends, they like, let's bygones be bygones or whatever. That again is a very simplistic explanation. Where girls, it can be an ongoing campaign of abuse, harassment, isolation, smearing, you know, all the kind of things that we know girls do that, you know, to one another. However, I would say that we need to be very careful in taking that as another blunt explanation for female perpetrated abuse, because we don't want to apply simplistic explanations to male perpetrators, and in the same breath we should not do the same for female perpetrators, because again, there will be trauma, addiction, emotional deregulation, you know, attachment. All the explanations that figure for men may also figure for women. They might just differ slightly depending on a gender perspective. So I suppose that's a very roundabout way of saying in some areas I would agree, because psychologically women kind of hone the skills from a very early age. But I would say you can't just look at the actions, you have to look at the motivations and the reasons of those motivations behind those actions. So in some ways I agree, and in others not so much. So
just before we come on to Sally asking a question, I'm reminded of the complaint, you don't hear it so much these days, which says something of men that, you know, that you know, they could be having an argument with their partner, and the partner will, let's say they're in the 50s, and the partner will come up with the way that they said a certain sentence 30 years ago.
Yeah,
and
they
have zero recollection. They have zero recollection of anything that happened in that year, but she can remember a particular tone of voice that he said something about somebody, and it's just like men just like, well, you know, we can't win on this battlefield. It's just, yeah.
And I must say, I have been guilty of that. Yeah, and I'm sure I'll be guilty of that going forward, as much as I try not to. My husband kind of reminds me of things about that and says, we're talking about this, not everything I've ever done ever. You know, so it's, you know,
that's a great answer.
You know, so he's right, and that will. Sometimes when we're in the midst of emotions or arguments or something like that, we can often go off and I remember the time on Tuesday, the 2nd of January, whenever you said this, and now you're saying, you know, we are capable of doing that.
Can you thank your husband? Is it Carl? Is his name's
John?
Carl? John, I'm sorry. An amazing drummer. Can you thank him for me for the best answer, for the best solution to that men's problem that I've ever heard of?
Yeah, and he's very calm about it. I think it takes some work in relationships, and I'm not just talking about heterosexual relationships or even intimate relationships. I'm talking about friendships. You know, especially in very heightened times such as COVID. I've seen devastating things where families have been split up by difference of opinion. I think sometimes we have to realise that stress plays a part in arguments. You know, we do have our own personality quirks. We're all human. I'm as flawed as any human. Just as a psychologist, I'm very, very aware of my fault.
Sean makes a wonderful comment. My sister's still angry about what my mum, RIP, said to her in 1966.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a lot of friction between parents and children, and particularly mothers and daughters. Often when I argue with or fall out with my daughter, it's often because we are very similar. And my late father, bless him, used to say to me, Debs, that's divine retribution. So
beautiful. Sally, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes. Okay, so this is from Carl Palmer, and he says, thank you, Debbie, for your presentation and research. I worked for 8 years as a therapist with males and females arrested for assault. I was made redundant. Sorry, Carl, read that a bit quirky. Made redundant because of a lack of funding for men. I used the Achieving Change Through Value-Based Behaviour, ACTV, which we know, program, as opposed to the horrid Duluth model. Are you aware of this intervention?
Short answer, no. But I would like to pick up something from Duluth. Duluth model is an ideology. I'm moving beyond the wheel at the minute. As a whole ideology has a central flaw that I think makes it terminal. which is it positions domestic abuse as a gendered issue. But again, if you look at the history behind this, this was at the start, well, a bit further on, but pretty much around the start of the women's movement. And as much as it will pain a lot of people to say this, we have to have respect for the women's movement to bring domestic abuse out of domestics and into the public notion. Whatever you think, that is an absolute truth. That's what they did. However, I then think the notion of domestic abuse was corrupted and sadly manipulated to the point where I don't think it actually helps anyone. However, if you look at the elements of the Duluth model and the behaviours identified within it, but remove power and control and remove gender, there's actually some really good insights in there around isolation, around controlling money, around how abuse, coercive abuse especially, manifests. There's some really good elements. And the reason I say that is the scale that we used in our 2 surveys last year to get this huge amount of data was very much based on the elements of the Duluth model. And we did that for 3 reasons. One, Nikki developed, and I'm talking about Professor Nicola Graham-Kevin here, who is my supervisor and an absolute inspiration to me on every single level, and very many others. She's a leading light in this field, and has produced the likes of Liz Bates, Louise Dixon. You know, she's got a legacy behind her as well as her research. But in her PhD, she developed a controlling behaviour scale, which is very much looking at those behaviours from the Duluth model and putting them in a scale that could be applicable to everyone and anyone. So we used that scale and added various elements from literature or our own surveys or that kind of stuff. So that in our second survey, we had 45 items that could be as applicable with a little bit of tweaking to women as they could men. But actually the core of it is based on all the elements that are developed and in place in the Duluth model. Because one of the second reasons we wanted to use that was that it shows that men are victimized in very similar ways to women. And often the reason that we don't know that is because when the Duluth model is applied to victims, it's often just female victims. And then there's a caveat that says, and men don't suffer in this way. And we wanted to address that gap. So we asked the men in our surveys, were they exposed to those kind of behaviours? So as much as I don't agree with the central philosophy of the Duluth model, I think the items in there are applicable to all victims. So we need to be careful how we kind of position that, if that makes sense.
Debs, I'd just like to say, just like to echo your comments about Professor Nicholas Graham-Kevin. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that she's a heroine to so many of us with a strong interest in domestic violence. And the politicians should hang their head in shame that they don't consult women like her and yourself, and you know, some male researchers, obviously. Now she was, and
the strange thing is, we're often portrayed as, well, I think you're all aware of the types and levels of abuse I get, and how I'm deemed a misogynist, which couldn't be further from the truth. I really can't stress that enough. But we're not monsters and we're not one-sided, and what we're asking for is an inclusive model of inclusive consideration of all victims and all perpetrators of domestic abuse. Because one of the things I really worry about is that female perpetrators are not getting the support that they need. And perpetrators, there is a small percentage of perpetrators that are what we see as evil or nasty or, you know, psychopathic or whatever. But I would say that the vast majority of perpetrators are not. They're actually vulnerable. And however their behaviour manifests, which is not acceptable, and this is not an excuse, this is an explanation. if we continue to label perpetrators as monsters, they don't get the help that they need. And there are still people that want to stay with people that have experienced domestic abuse. We don't often hear about couples therapy, and we know from the data that the most common form of domestic abuse is bi-directional, but we're only treating one side of that and not the other side of that. And so how can that dynamic work? We need to take a big gulp, pull our pants up and our socks up and say, okay, this is an inclusive view. We need to have inclusive solutions. We need to move away from monsters and make sure that women, there was something on Twitter today, and every time I look at it, it makes me want to cry. Another child was murdered by a woman, and there's uproar about it. There's absolute scandal about it, and often the police are blamed, or social services are blamed, or whoever. It's very easy to blame all these people, but as a society, we've ignored this for so long that are we expecting social workers to move beyond the acceptance of society that says, oh no, this doesn't really, females aren't like this, it's the big bad men that we need to talk about. And actually the big bad men that murder children and commit abuse and stuff, yes, we do need to talk about that. We need to address that, of course we do. But in the same breath, we need to do exactly the same for women. Could it been that if we and this is, hindsight's an exact science, could it be that if we'd have had more conversations about female perpetrated violence, that we could have saved that child because social services would have been able to pick it up quicker? Because I know social workers, they are absolutely in it up to their neck. They're really trying most people in these services really do try their best. So, but if they'd have had different training, could they have been more aware of it? Could the police have picked it up if that had been in their training and they were more? And these are all could have, should have, would have, But do we just let this go again and talk about learning the lessons without learning the lessons? Or do we have to sit down and go, look, we know that you wedded to that idea and we're happy that you were wedded to that idea, but come on the journey with us. Let's try and save a few people here.
So
and I think that's why we need to see it through the child's lens. I mean, more children are harmed and killed by mothers than fathers.
Yeah.
Just want to finish off on Nicola Graham Kevin. She was the keynote speaker at the online national conference on domestic violence, which we ran last year, which you gave a presentation as well, Deborah. And if anybody wants to find, all the videos, along with all the conference videos ever, are on j4mb.org.uk. Sorry, Sally, go on.
No, sorry, Mike. Just for the audience's purposes, can I just let you know what that model is for Carl? It's short for Achieving Change Through Value-Based Behaviour. It was created in 2017, and it's based on a collaborative model. So Carl has said that if the other models, obviously Duluth model, it works from the premise of patriarchy. And he says with the ACTV is based on people making commitments to the therapeutic intervention. So there's
okay,
and it's a multidisciplinary intervention. So it was done it was created, I believe, as part of organisations working together with the penal. For us, it's Ministry of Justice. It's the prison services. So it was a partnership working, and in the delivery of that, and it was people being willing to work on that themselves. So it's a completely different perspective. So I just wanted people to know, because acronyms and short things, people wouldn't necessarily know what that means. And so there is a models out there. I think that was 2017. It started to be worked with. So just for everybody's purpose, that's all. So thanks, Mike.
Brilliant. No, thank you.
Thanks for that clarification, Sally. We come to the $64,000 questions here from Tom Chadwick. I would like to know, why are female victims overlooked? What causes so many people to ignore or dismiss this phenomenon?
Yeah, that is the $64,000 question, isn't it? I think it's a combination of many things. One is in the field, it has been dominated by a gendered perspective for 50 years. We recently had a dinner to celebrate Erin Pizzey's 50 years of opening the first ever domestic abuse shelter. And what I was able to give a little speech on that, and I came to it from the, again, inclusive view that back in the day when Erin was doing this, things didn't sit right with her, and she opened a shelter for women, and then she opened a shelter for men, and got some funding for men and then didn't. And it's because, I suppose you can put an evolutionary bent on this to say that men, as you know, we're a sexually reproducing species, and women invest 9 months of their time growing a human being, and then several years trying to make sure that human being is able to cope with life. You know, years, there's a lot of investment from a female perspective that we have to protect as a society. We have to protect the ability to continue our species. So there is an element, some would argue, that men are relatively disposable compared to women, and that's where we have our focus. I would completely disagree on several levels, but I would also agree that in some realms we do need to protect women. In some areas, there are areas across the world that both men and women need protection for different reasons. Again, I think it's because there is such an evolutionary focus on women. I think it's been very, and again, whatever you think about the feminist movement, there's been some great things that have come from that. And you also have to admire their ability to link and work together across a global platform. Something which, for whatever reason, we don't see a huge proportion of men, and that might just be because men aren't like that.
It's also Debs, I've got to say, helped by billions of pounds of taxpayers' money, mainly men's.
Yes, totally. I understand that. I understand that completely. But still, the sort of coordination and group work and showing up on committees and creating committees and doing all that is to be admired. You know, they right. Show up to all these places.
Right, but I mean, men could not duplicate that because they would never get funding. I mean, there's no funding for men's issues, as you know. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing against men doing it. I would also say that in that instance, then maybe women need to put their money where their mouth is and start coordinating the men, as it were. We're very good at doing that in the home, and I'm not saying that from a patriarchal perspective. We're very good at doing that as mothers and wives and sisters and all the rest of it. And I have to say that I have to be honest that I would put my research success down to the fact that a lot of men have coordinated and helped me and got my surveys out there and taken that leap to respond to my surveys and open their heart up and give me their experience. So they do it. They do it. And strangely enough, what is wrong with a woman leading that? You know, it doesn't, if we're going, crikey, that's what a feminist would say, wouldn't it? Women should lead this. Women should lead this activity. So let's absolutely do it.
No, you make very good points, Debbie. But you'll be aware as anybody that that Erin Pizzey, when she was booted out of the Chiswick refuges, they were basically being underwritten financially by a number of rich men. She asked them for some money for refuge for male victims. Not one penny was forthcoming. So there's no government.
Totally.
So there's no government money and there's no private money. Apart from that, we're loaded.
But I would, well, from my perspective on research, not on opening a shelter, I would argue that maybe shelters are not the be all and end all for male victims, but you know, there's other things and time for a different debate. But I would say from a research perspective, what I heard coming into this was it's very difficult to get any victim of domestic abuse to give you their experience because of all the reasons why. It's embarrassing. And I'm talking from a victim myself. It's embarrassing. You feel shame. You feel you should have done something better. A lot of victims turn it in on themselves. You know, it's part of the abuse, as it were. And I was told that it's very difficult to get victims to share their story. And that's even before we start talking about male victims. Yet here I am, sat on nearly 4,000 stories of male victims from across various continents in the world that have shared their story with me. And I don't know why. I think it's because I'm honest. I think it's because I kind of put myself out there, or people trust me for some reason. And that's an element that's missing for men. And understandably, that they don't trust researchers because all the research says that this is a patriarchal issue. But when they do trust you, it floods in. It floods in. And maybe an explanation is that men are happy to fund women to do something more than they're happy to fund men. And that doesn't necessarily need to be fixed. It might just be the way it is.
I think you could well be right. Sally, I've sent you a couple of comments in the chat. Mm-hmm. So if you want to click on chat, you'll get to those. Okay. But if you'd like to ask one of your own questions, Sally, one of the ones that we spoke of just before we started.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. Okay, so Deborah, you've talked about your own personal journey and how you've reflected on how coming from a positive family background that you found yourself within a very negative relationship yourself, experiencing that. Did this give you a lot of insight into interpersonal violence that you could share with men and women who are currently experiencing that? I mean, the purpose of that question was about looking at, how do we see that coming? Because if, we talk about a lot of the time about intergenerational abuse and about patterns of behavior and things like that, but sometimes these things don't come based from that background and you're landed with them. So it's a bit like, how do you identify these things? What are those intricacies in the relationships? So how did that work for you? How did that influence your work?
Well, the strange thing is that I've done a lot of self-reflection. Actually, my master's and my PhD have been a huge amount of self-reflection, if the truth be known. And again, hindsight's an exact science, but one of the things I've done is, how did I get myself into that situation? And that's not me victim blaming. It's me trying to find the tools to not get myself into that situation again. Okay, it's just you don't want to repeat the same pattern. So what led me into that pattern? And strangely enough, we have to remember that good traits can often be as destructive as bad traits if they are over relied on. And bear with me because I'll explain that. My family background was just ordinary. It was just ordinary. And it was actually very gendered in its makeup. My dad went out to work, and I still remember my dad coming home and handing the pay packet to my mum, an actual pay packet of cash, before we went through this industrial revolution of technology. And my mum did everything in the house with that money. She did everything. She ruled that domain. Nothing happened in that house unless my mum gave it the go ahead. It was absolutely gendered. But it was brilliant. It worked for us. It worked for our family, and it was a family of its day. That's not to negate anyone else's family or their view of family. That's just mine. But what was absolutely drummed into us was the importance of family. Our own little nucleus, our extended family. We often had cousins and things staying with us when their families were going through difficulties, and they were treated in exactly the same way as us. There was no difference. They were loved as much as we were. They were disciplined as much as we were. It was just the way it was. And we would ask as children, why is such a body staying with us? You know, things happen in families, but what you have to do is look after each other. So when I got married to my first partner, there were indicators leading up there. He had a very volatile relationship with his mother. And I just thought, well, you know, there's been stresses in the family. Maybe it's just their relationship. Maybe he's stressed. Maybe they were under the same roof for some time. Maybe it's just an extension of that. And what was happening is I was rationalizing poor behavior because I liked this person. I treated them like an, in inverted commas, normal person. And I was giving them the benefit of the doubt. One of the things I would say is a big indicator is if you are continually giving your partner or friend or family the benefit of the doubt, maybe have a look at what those benefits entail and what impact those benefits have on you. Because my commitment to family, my commitment to my wedding vows, and my commitment to my marriage put me in a position of being abused. It put me in a position where I thought, you stick with your family, you show them loyalty. I believe in sickness and in health. I believe in all those things. But there becomes a point where normal friction and conflict that happens in relationships becomes very one-sided and very abusive. So have a think about not just how you are being managed or controlled by your partner, but how much self-regulation you do to avoid impact. So I started cutting off friends and family because I just couldn't put up with the shit I'd get when I got home. So I started to what I call self-comply. So I'd be like, well, I'm not going out on Friday night because I can't be dealing with all this stuff when I get home. And that to me is a key indicator that's often missed. Not necessarily the abuse that is being directly impacting on you, but how you start to do this, what I call compelled compliance, where they don't even have to say the word, you're doing the dirty work for them. And the more I delve into my data and my research and the literature and talk to other colleagues that are approaching it from a female-centered perspective or a child perspective, there's a core forming here that is actually about compelled compliance. That is something that I don't think we have discussed, or I suppose brought together as a research centre that says, have a look at your behaviour when this is happening.
So if you just transport that one thought into an environment where you are delivering services and you want men and women to collaborate together, because currently in the meetings that I go in or attend, you know, stuff, local government or charities working together, you can see that element playing out into that realm. So for example, where you go into a room of 20 people who are colleagues working together, who are very articulate in talking about what services need, what people need, how that is, and you see men that are very silent. There's an almost opposite transaction that's going on. And I to some degree, it's almost self-abuse from men, because I'm constantly trying to encourage men to have a voice because they need to have one. I understand why they're very quiet in that voice, but there needs to be, you know, some permissions within there. But there's a similar coercion to be silent or to adjust your life, you know, and that's very much out in that environment. So, I mean, do you see that in there? You know, I mean, we are privileged. We know you've just got a new role and that you're now lecturing, all exciting stuff, which means you're influencing younger generation of academics that are coming up, and then they'll be stepping into that throne of their professionalism. You know, have you thought about that and how that you can give permissions for both? To have voices?
And I have a real passion for critical thinking in the traditional sense of the word, and I apply that to me, my work. You know, am I dismissing something because I've labelled it something else? Do I need to take some golden threads from that to bring it through to my data? So I think as much as it's something that we use to critique other people's work and opinions and everything else, we need to be very, it sounds very hippie-ish, but I think self-reflection is an incredible tool for you. But I think for me, there's an element that And I'm going to use this quote, something that we were talking to beforehand. One of my absolute inspirations is Camille Paglia, and I know for a lot of people that'll be somewhat strange because she's a feminist, but I absolutely, it would be my dream to meet her. It really would. But she has this fantastic quote that I've used often, which is teenage boys, goaded by their surging hormones, run in packs like the primal horde. They only have a brief season of exhilarating liberty between controlled by their mothers and controlled by their wives. And what that says to me is that men have little freedom for a voice in our society. And however that manifests, it's because they are controlled by their mothers. They are absolutely controlled by their mothers, and then they are controlled by their wives. So there's a gap in between this primal horde of running through in packs before they move from mother to wife. And as much as we hear this thing of mansplaining, I hate that word, and women being silenced in conference rooms, I must say, having been in many a conference room in a former life and now, I have never felt silence ever, and to be fair, woe betide anyone, whatever gender, if that was their tactic, it wouldn't work very well. But I think it's often I do know there are people that do that in both sexes and all genders to try and capture everybody in that. So it's I worry this notion of toxic masculinity and what I call the scrawny finger of misogyny. That's not to dismiss misogyny that does happen, because clearly it does, just like misandry and hate crime and everything else does happen. But often it's thrown about to dismiss someone or threaten someone or silence someone. I've been called a misogynist repeatedly for years since I've started this research. Truth is not anywhere near that. But I think men just think, I'm going to shut up because it's not worth the hassle. And when I say it like that, it mirrors exactly what I was saying about not going out with my friends because it's not worth the hassle when I get home. And men have learned that. It's not worth the hassle off your mum. It's not worth the hassle off your wife. It's not worth the hassle off your teacher. It's not, because in all these areas, they are female dominated. So I find it restrictive and disempowering in a way when we hear that women don't have a voice or women don't get to speak, because we speak a lot. I know I never shut up.
I agree with you 100%. And one of the things that I keep saying to groups of men and individual men, please, we women actually need your voice. We need to know what you think, And I know
I also not to silence you in any way and talk over you, Sally, but no, I also think that there's a lot of services, because they've been led by women, that are created for women based on women's experiences. And that's not to say that they won't do some men a great deal of good, but I do think we need to have a very similar and parallel services. And I say that in inverted commas, because I think women are happy to sit in a room, some women happy to sit in a room with a counsellor and unpick every detail of their lives, while some women are not. And I think men generally would prefer not to sit in a room with a middle-aged woman like me and share their deepest, darkest thoughts. I don't know if men want to share their deepest, darkest thoughts. I think they just want some resources to be able to handle their deepest, darkest thoughts, however that manifests, whether it's a walk in the Lake District on a pilot with me, or if it's fixing a car, or going to the pub, or I don't know, put it in a box and taping it up and never looking at it again. Whatever tools are, it's not necessarily the services that are made for women by women based on women's experiences.
I agree.
Debbie, we have about 10 minutes left. I can wrap up about 2 or 3 minutes to the hour. We have 4 wonderful questions, which Sally and I will alternate. The first of them I've been looking forward to asking you. I think it's probably the most challenging, you'll find it the most challenging question so far, but it's also a question I think that's on all our minds. So Brian writes this, question for Deborah, why are you so brilliant?
Oh, I don't think I am. I think I do something because I'm passionate about it. And I think I desperately try to take a balanced view. I'm not always good at that. Sometimes I get very cross about things. Sometimes I get over emotional about things because I see the harm that they do. And it hurts me. It hurts me to have to read that or see it or even secondary experience that. I'm very aware of my flaws and I quite like them. I've come to terms with my flaws and my scars. And I think that's what's so disappointing, I think, in a lot of people, that a lot of people think they're above reproach. They think that or they hold me up to some expectation that I'm never going to achieve. But ultimately, I think the majority of people come from the very best of intention. It might be misguided, but I think they very much come from the best intention. And I have to believe that in order to carry on doing what I do. I think if I didn't, and there are days where I just think, I can't do this anymore. And I've said this many times, and it always makes me emotional, because now and again an email will drop into my inbox that says something like, I couldn't take it anymore, and then I saw you on a video, or I saw you fist pumping on the table, or going on about something or whatever, and it just gave me that enough to get out of bed and do something different today, just to know. And then all of a sudden, all the harassment, all the hassle, everything else disappears. And even things like with a group of us, we organised that dinner for Erin, and handing her the first Erin Pitsey Award for services to all victims of domestic abuse, handing that to her and almost saying, thank you, we'll take it from here. We'll try and do our very best with this. Makes it all worthwhile.
Thank you, Debs. It'd be great if we could get to all of these.
Okay, I'll try and be a bit more succinct.
Okay, and Sally, could you please ask? Sorry,
okay.
2 seconds. Sean's question next, please.
Sean, okay. So Sean is saying, I contend that women's unhappiness is essential for the survival of feminism and the maintenance of the profitable activities in charities and academia that feminists engage in. What in the literature indicates that men really have been oppressed in women in the domestic sphere for centuries, as feminists say?
Yeah, that's where it all becomes a bit jaded, because if you look in the literature, so for example, I don't know if I've got it here. Yes, I have. There's a couple of books that I keep for quick reference, shall we say. And when it comes to evidence, this is where it begins to flounder. And this is the difference between belief and I suppose proof. As a scientist, I hate to say proof, but as actual evidence-based opinion as opposed to belief opinion. So Evan Stark has a book called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, and it's a tome. There's a huge amount of data in here. And I must admit, when I was looking to recover from domestic abuse, I picked this up. It's a very well distributed book, but there's something in it that really highlights the difficulty in this literature, because it says, after he's been talking about and looking at coercive control, he says, at this point, I ask readers to take 2 things on faith. Faith. That the pattern of intimidation, isolation, and control is unique to men's abuse of women, and that it is critical to explaining why women become entrapped in abusive relationships in ways that men do not, and experience abuse as ongoing. And then he says, but if we assume this pattern is gender specific, so it's faith and assumption, and that's where it becomes dogma, because it's taken as gospel when it's just asked on faith and assumption. And as a scientist, you cannot be swayed by that argument. In fact, it makes you suspicious. And that's indicative of a lot of very influential texts that are out there that formulated that view. As far as women's unhappiness is concerned, I think constantly telling them to live in fear, and telling them that men are toxic and masculinity is toxic and you are going to be attacked, I don't think that is in any way empowering, and I don't think it in any way drives towards the solution.
No, but it drives money into feminist charities.
It does.
And for that, we need to hold them accountable, because
Absolutely.
it's going against the very thing they say they do.
Yeah. Okay, we come on to a question from Mike Bell, who's a member of Gender Parity UK, as is Sally. And Mike's doing some great work. He says, as a psychologist, what advice would you give men in the men's movement so that we can take more effective change?
I would say you need to be careful that you don't become the thing that you despise. So within the feminist movement, like any movement, there are people that are extreme and really pontificate about hating men and all the rest of it. If we expect feminism to tackle that, men in the men's movement also need to tackle it within their own movement, and ensure that we're leading by example as opposed to pointing the finger in that way. My ultimate advice.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Debs, but I can't personally. I mean, these conferences, which started in 2014, I think are the nearest thing that we have to a window on the global men's rights movement. And when we're accused of misogyny, I sometimes say, look, there's probably 300 to 400 presentations, never mind Q&As, on our website. I defy you to find one sentence.
I agree.
I do not know any misogynists.
But that's what we should be saying. We should be saying, show us the evidence. I had a rather heated Twitter debate once on where an American woman was calling me a misogynist, and her answer to me asking why, before she threatened to report me for misogyny, was to say it's your entire feed. And there is, you're welcome to go through my feed. There is nothing on there that is in any way misogynist. I present data about male victims because it's a gap in the research and it's a gap in society that's my job. As a PhD student, my job is to find a gap in the knowledge and fill it. That's what you need to do to extend that. I would agree. I think a challenge to your narrative is not misogynist. It's a challenge to your narrative. If you counter that by calling someone or accusing them of a hate crime, then that's on you. I haven't experienced or witnessed or been privy to anything misogynist, and I've been welcomed in to the men's movement. Even though I say I'm not a men's rights activist, I'm not a feminist, I'm a researcher that's issue based, and I've been absolutely clear about that from the beginning.
Robert Brockway is the Australian man, a good friend, who runs the Australian leg of this conference. He makes a very good point. He says the men's rights movement pushes extremists to the side. Feminism lets them into leadership roles. He's
got a good point. I can't disagree with that at all. I think I have real concerns about how some very extreme radical feminists are catapulted into leadership positions that then trickles down and influences everything else. And Robert's quite right, where that exists within the men's movement, it is pushed to the side and dealt with. I would expect the same from any movement, including the feminist movement. And I do think there's a lot of feminists that are appalled by that. We see it in the trans
Deborah, I'm
movement.
sorry. We have like half a minute left. So
okay.
I'll make it a very quick question. Tom Chadwick, thank you for this. Do you think patriarchy is a feminist myth or an empirical reality?
I don't subscribe to patriarchy as a concept in any way. I understand the way the law used to work and everything else, but if you dig into it, men were not so much given ownership as women, as given a protective role over women. Currently, as it stands, no.
Couldn't agree more. Deborah, thank you so much for a wonderful Q&A. That was absolutely fascinating.
No, I've loved it. Thank you.
And thank you, Sally, for co-hosting.
No, welcome.
And so we'll be back in in an hour for the next Q&A, I guess. Look forward to that. And and thanks to all the attendees and the questions and so on. And it's a wrap. Bye for now.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.